Hello everyone and welcome to the Digital Classicist London Seminar for 2021. This is the beginning of our summer series, although we've already had one sort of prologue session just over a month ago. We've got 6 seminars lined up for you this summer, spaced out every 2 weeks unusually rather than our normal weekly schedule. And if you need a reminder of the programme as a whole, there it is at the moment on the screen below you. And there are also occasional seminars running throughout the autumn and winter of 21-22 as well. I'm Eleanor Robson. I'm one of the co-conveners of the seminar series, along with my colleagues Gabby Bodard, Valeria Vitale and Paolo Granados. We're all normally in London, but scattered at various points at home at the moment, like most people, I think. But we think we're still trying to sort of retain that London and yet global identity. Some of you may well have been used to our live streaming of these seminars long before it became necessary and fashionable to do so last year. But if you haven't been to the seminar before, a very, very warm welcome, and I hope you'll find it enjoyable and interesting. A couple of words about how the technicalities work, and then I'll introduce our speaker for today. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, of course, so we've got all the normal YouTube functionality. You can use the comments function in YouTube to introduce yourself at any point if you'd like to. If you'd like to put a question to our speaker, do that too. You can pose the question as you think of it during the talk, or there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions too. There is a 10-second delay, more or less, between you adding the live broadcast and it appearing in YouTube. So I won't be able to respond to questions instantaneously. So we'll have a little bit of chat between the speaker and the conveners before we open up the floor to questions at the end, and that'll give us a chance to collect your questions. So please don't think we're ignoring you. And we're going to run for about an hour, but if the conversation is still interesting and stimulating, we'll certainly go a little bit beyond that. But yeah, do feel free to log off at any time. So let me turn to today's talk, which I'm really looking forward to as a specialist in cuneiform script. For me, the Indus Valley script is a neighbour, as it were, and there's something that's always been very tantalising because of the very clear contacts between southern Iraq and the Indus Valley, particularly in the 3rd millennium BC. So I'm particularly excited to be introducing today's speaker, Dr. Andreas Fuls. Well, let me say a little. I'm sure he'll explain a little bit more about the interactive corpus of Indus text in the course of his talk. But he's been involved with this corpus not quite since its inception. It was developed by Dr. Brian Wells in the 2000s at Harvard, and Dr. Fuls became involved in 2009. So this is a really very long-running project. It's a relational database of about 5,500 texts. And the work they've been doing on it, as we'll see, is very much about statistical and mathematical analysis of script. So this is Dr. Fuls's particular interest, approaching it from an engineering and mathematics point of view, how one can use statistics and mathematics, issues around sign frequency, etc. And so his own work in this area isn't just on the Indus Valley. He started off with a PhD on the correlations between the Maya and the Christian calendars. So again, Maya hieroglyphs being another really interesting philological challenge, and has worked more recently too on the Physos disc and on Cretan hieroglyphics, with a book that came out in 2019 on that topic. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Dr. Fuls has to say to us today on his topic of mathematical epigraphy and the interactive corpus of Indus text. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction. So today I will talk about the mathematical epigraphy and the interactive corpus of texts. So the Indus civilization is one of the Bronze Age cultures extended in the Indus Valley in present Pakistan in North India at around 2600 BC until around 1800 BC. So there have been many sites already excavated during the last 100 years. The most important sites are Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Lothal, and others. And as can be seen on this slide, there have been also a strong contact between the Indus Valley and the cultures in the Persian Gulf area in Mesopotamia. So 100 years ago, excavations started at Harappa in 1920 and in 1922 at Mohenjo-Daro. So during this 100 years, most inscribed artifacts have been found at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Altogether, 80% of all texts are coming from these two sites. And as can be seen on the two maps, actually these inscriptions were found on 3 different mounds or excavation areas. So Mount F and Mount E at Harappa and the DKG area at Mohenjo-Daro. They account for about 80% of all inscriptions known to us. So before analyzing an undeciphered writing system, you are looking for all inscriptions available which have been excavated and published. So building up a corpus as big as possible. Of course, this has already started at the very beginning. So the first one by Langdon from 1931 consisted just of 750 texts or inscribed artifacts with 288 signs. So the number of signs and the number of available inscriptions, of course, somehow are correlated. And they have been growing from time to time. And the first very useful inscription and corpus was published in 1977 by Mahadevan with a little more than 2,900 inscribed artifacts. Of course, this corpus is now a little bit outdated since we have available more corpus data published and entered into this what I call interactive corpus of Indus texts, or in short, ICIT. So currently we have more than 5,500 texts. So at the present time, we have 4,539 inscribed artifacts. Most of them are coming from the Indus Valley, as shown here on the map. And some of these inscribed artifacts are have two-sided texts. So we have 5,512 texts. And of these texts, there are more than 17,000 signs legible. For the analysis of sign positional behavior, we need complete texts. So there are a little more than 3,600 texts complete with 17,607 sign occurrences altogether that can be analyzed for positional distribution of signs. And the sign list currently consists of 704 distinct signs. I will come to this point later on. Additionally, there are 900 artifacts just with iconography. So the database also contains symbols or iconographic elements recorded on the seals along with texts or just the symbols. So altogether, more than 5,000 iconographic elements are also recorded in the database. The signs are recorded as a 3-digit sign number with a minus sign in between as a sign sequence, as shown here in the example of 3 sign text below. So this is makes it quite easy to search for these signs and sign patterns in the database. The database schema is shown here as an UML class diagram of this object relational database using MySQL as a database management system in the background. So the center point is the classes of artifacts. So all artifacts are stored in this class. And of course, this class is related to the find spot, the site, and the site is related to the region. On the other side, you have artifacts, of course, related to the texts, at least one for the inscribed artifacts, and the texts are related to the sign list in a specific order, of course. Additionally, we have your class of the iconography, if there is any visible, and there are also more than 15,000 images related to the artifacts. All these classes are mapped onto tables, 29 altogether, and the total sum of all data entries, just to give you a number, is about 1,200,000. So there are many different artifact types with text on it. Just to show you the most important texts, artifact types, they are these are pottery inscriptions, seals of different shapes, square seals, rectangular seals, but sometimes also cylinder seals or circular seals. And then we have bas-relief tablets, which that can be read directly as they are, presenting the text. And then there are tablets made out of copper and incised tablets. Most times they are two-sided texts. And finally, as you can see on the bottom, there are also sealings and on clay that can be found. Most of these sealings are coming from Dolavira in Lothal. So the map on this slide shows you that the different artifact types are actually not homogeneously distributed, but very different for each excavation site. So most of the bas-relief tablets and incised tablets are coming from Harappa, but the most of the square seals are coming from Mohenjo-Daro. Along with the text, there are many metadata recorded in the database. So each artifact has a unique identifier, the ICIT ID, in this case, for example, 1020. There is also a link to the photographic corpus of seals and inscriptions by Papola, the so-called CC number. There are more information available about the color, the size of the artifact, the boss type, if available, and of course, the exact found place, like the mount, the trench, and the period associated with, along with the excavation number. When you have a text on this artifact, the signs are recorded as a sequence of sign codes, along with a status about the completeness of this text, the reading direction, the number of lines. There are not only text with one line, but also you will see 2 or more lines, and the text condition. If there's an iconographic element visible on the artifact, you can see when there is a symbol, the type of a symbol recorded, the facing direction of animals, and the completeness again, along with the cult object. All this information is complemented by an image source, references, and the museum. So after collecting the corpus of inscriptions, the next task is to build up a sign list. which is not an easy task. Because you have to distinguish between distinct signs with different meaning, and on the other side, allographic variations of one sign. That means if there are graphemes of different shape, but identical meaning. So for this reason, you should perform structural comparison of signs. For example, two graphically similar signs, here in this case, sign 920 and 921. They are the mirrored version of each other. And the question is, are these the same sign or the distinct signs? And as you can see in the different, on this table, where you need to read the texts from right to left, and the different fields, field 1, 2, 3, and 4, gives you an idea about how the signs are grouped into different fields. And you can see that in the top part, sign 921 and 920 are used both in field number 4, but in field number 1, if you look a little bit below, only sign number 920 is used. So there is a distinct different usage of these signs if you look for the structural analysis. Therefore, these mirrored signs have a distinct usage and probably also different meaning. Another way of looking for the different behavior of signs is to look for the frequency on different artifact types. As I have already shown you, there are many different artifact types. And as an example, there are 3 different signs, 154, 156, and 158. They are graphically similar, but as you can see in this graph of a 3-dimensional frequency, they are not evenly distributed. Actually, this graph does not show you the frequency directly, but what I call the factor of homogeneous distribution. And the reason for this factor, introducing this factor, is that you need to take into account not only the different frequency of each sign, but also the different frequency of each artifact type. And if the factor of homogeneous distribution is greater than 1, you are looking at the overrepresentation. And if it is smaller than 1, it's underrepresentation. So you see that for sign 154, it occurs mostly on rectangular seals, 156 mostly on incised tablets, and sign 158 on bas-relief tablets. Therefore, these 3 different signs should be distinguished as distinct signs, not merged into one sign, as done by other researchers, as I will show you here in this slide. There are these and other signs which have been put by Mahadevan and by Pola in their sign list into one sign graph with just one sign number, and thereby merging these different signs into one sign and reducing the total number of signs into a number of around 400. So 419 for Mahadevan and 386 signs for Papola's sign list. This is in sharp contrast to the way Dr. Brian Wells and later on myself are looking at the signs. We are only merging signs into one sign graph if we are sure that they are replacement sets, which indicates that these 2 different graphemes are really allographs of one sign. And for this reason, if the sign list is much bigger and longer, with more than 700 signs at present, so the rule of thumb is to leave signs distinct if you are not sure about their structural behavior, not to merge signs which might be distinct or not. This is the second part of the sign list from 2020. And the most frequent sign is sign 740, so-called jar sign. In pattern texts, I will come to this point later on, what it means. It occurs mostly in terminal position, and it is therefore used as a grammatical marker. So on the very right left end of the text. But the same sign is also used 34 times as a solo text. So just one sign 740 as one complete text, as you can see in these two examples. So in these cases, I think that sign 740 is nothing else than used as a logogram. So the high frequency of this sign is most likely based on the fact that it is used for different purposes and different positions, as a grammatical marker, but also sometimes as a logogram. Well, if you look for the positional distribution of a sign, you can calculate what I call a normalized weighted sign position histogram. So all texts which are complete are reduced or stretched to the same text length of 10 positions, which allows you to calculate a weight for each text position of each sign occurrence, and then adding the weights into this histogram, which clearly indicates that the highest frequency of this sign are in position 9 and 10, so at the left end of texts. Well, the number of signs in the sign list depends on the corpus size. And this is illustrated by this diagram showing you the result of 10 simulations, adding more and more text in a random order up to the corpus of 17,757 signs. And as you can see, after this 10 simulations, the percentage of singletons, so these are signs which occur only once in the whole corpus, is about 1.26%. And it has can be replaced, substituted by a power function with a specific exponent. And as you can see in the formula, and this power function allows us to estimate the number of singletons for a corpus of more signs than now available. So for a corpus of 30,000 signs, there are 0.976% of singletons or 69 additional singletons coming that would be added to the sign list. So 773 signs would be about this sign list long. And if you have even a corpus of 1 million signs, then 626 new signs will be added to the sign list. So the sign list would have a range of about 1,330 signs. So we are dealing with a corpus and a sign list which is not fixed forever. This is the main point. And of course, we are only dealing with artifacts which have survived the 4,000 years after the decline of the Indus culture. So all the organic material which might have been used to write as a writing material for inscriptions are perished and not available. Next question I'd like to discuss is the type of writing system. So there are different types of writing systems: alphabets, syllables, logographic writing systems. And so the question is, what kind of writing system we are looking at Indus writing? Just looking at the total number of signs in the sign list is one way, which gives you a rough idea. So 400 or even 700 signs in the corpus clearly indicates it's not an alphabet. It's most likely not purely syllabic. But how to be sure? Well, I'm looking here at the sign frequency distribution. And this is a similar procedure as calculating the curve of the Zipf's law for word counts. And for the Indus writing system, I get a power function with an exponent, what I call exponent g, of about -1.3, which is shown here in this double logarithmic diagram as a straight line. And I can do the same for known writing systems: alphabets, syllabic writing systems, word counts, and others, like Egypt hieroglyphs, Maya glyphs, and so on. So these known writing systems, they give me a relationship which is approximately linear between this exponent g and the percentage of syllables or signs with one consonant for the Egypt hieroglyphs. And this regression line allows me to estimate the percentage of syllables for Indus writing as well. So using this exponent g on the x-axis, and this value crosses the regression line at about 50% syllables, which means we are looking at a logographic syllabic writing system with approximately 50% syllabus and 50% logograms. The next question I like to talk about is the reading direction. So there are several indications from a epigraphic point of view looking for the direction of writing. And these are blank spaces after the last sign. Sometimes signs are reversed, or they are squeezed at the end because of a lack of space, or put in the second line. On pottery, you can find examples that the next left sign crosses or overlaps the previous sign. And there are examples of writing from top to bottom. However, this is, of course, dealing with the writing direction. Is this the same as the reading direction? Well, there is a very interesting article published by Ashraf and Sina from 2018, calculating the so-called Gini index, G. So they calculate the number and frequency of characters or signs at the left end and at the right end of words, or in this case for Indus writing, as on texts. And the difference of the Gini index for left and right end on words gives you a value which corresponds to the reading direction of known writing systems. So for modern English and for Luwian hieroglyphic writing, you have a Gini index difference which is negative. And for other writing systems like Hebrew and Arabic, which must be read from right to left, this Gini index difference is positive in the same way as it is positive for the Indus writing system. So we can be sure about the reading direction on Indus inscriptions is from right to left. And this is consistent for at least 90% of all texts available in the corpus. Indus texts are mostly very short, 2, 3, 4 signs. So this histogram of a text length shows you the distribution of complete texts only. Of course, there are sometimes multi-line texts, and as you can see in this image, there are 3 lines of texts, and they should not be used as one long text with 17 signs, but 3 lines with 6, 4, and 7 signs respectively. The next question I like to talk about are different text types. I have already talked about different types of artifacts, and now we are looking for the different pattern of sign occurrences, how they are combined in the sequences of inscriptions. And one method to analyze sign sequences is to calculate the segmentation tree. So the segmentation is a process to separate longer sign sequences into smaller units by determining morphological boundaries between signs and looking for bounded sign clusters within each text. Of course, we do not know, because it's an unknown writing system, undeciphered, where the morphological boundaries are placed in these texts, in these sign sequences. There are no word dividers. So I have extended previously proposed segmentation methods which are using the pair frequency by another parameters like the ratio between terminal to initial sign frequency. And so these different statistical parameters are the reason to give this name the multivariate segmentation method I have developed. And the result is this segmentation tree. You see the thickness of the lines are indicating how strong 2 signs as a pair are connected to each other, which is also given in the circle as a connectivity value. So this is a very interesting and easy way to look for the internal structure of sign sequences. Another method is the structural analysis of sign sequences. So in the database, you can search for one sign, or for example, in this case, 3 identical signs as a triplet. They are aligned here in this diagram in one column, and everything, all the signs on the left and on the right are placed in different columns. So in most cases, you see that these complete texts are starting with an initial cluster on the right end. Then there are some signs which are looking like strokes or like fish signs, most likely representing some numerical expression, or fish signs most likely representing some way of weighing. And at the end, you have this triplet. But there are also other cases where the triplet can be found in the initial position. So the multivariant segmentation tree gives us a nice way of looking for the internal structure of Indus inscriptions. So that you have at the very beginning, for pattern text, an initial cluster. Then in the medial part, you have fish signs, oval signs, and numerical signs. And at the end, you have a terminal cluster with one or more signs. This is also shown here in this table, that the elements in these different fields are ordered in a certain way, and this order is fairly consistent. And this is the reason why these texts are called pattern texts, because they represent this constant pattern of sign occurrences in a structured way. However, there are also other types of texts. And it is quite interesting if you combine the different text types and also with the positional histogram of signs. For example, Sign 590, shown here in the middle, has a positional histogram showing on the left lower end for all complete texts. And this would indicate that this sign is used anywhere in all positions except not so often at the very end, in terminal position. However, if you calculate the positional histogram not for all complete texts, but only for short pattern texts, then the position of this sign is emphasized in the mid-medial position, 6 and 7. For the long pattern texts, it's emphasized more frequent in position 8, in the late medial position, and in multiple segment texts, suddenly it occurs in the early part of the text, so in position 1, 2, or 3. And there is a range of complex texts, which are either long or short, and the sequence of signs, they do not show any systematic pattern, so that's the reason why they are called complex. And you can see in the histogram of this sign, the sign occurs in almost every position in complex texts. So this is just demonstrating the necessity to distinguish between different types of texts when analyzing Indus inscriptions. All these different functionality and analysis can be performed using the user interface of the ICIT database. And I'll just show you one example here, searching for a specific combination of a sign 740 at the end and the other sign 255 in second position. And you will get all the different metadata associated with each text and so on. So this is the user interface, which makes it possible for you to interact with the database in the background without programming SQL directly. This is done by the software in the background. And these are the references used in this presentation. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. That was fascinating. And it reminds me in some ways of the work that's been going on in sort of my corner of the world in trying to crack Proto-Elamite, the still mostly undeciphered script of southwest Iran from the late 4th millennium BC. I wanted to ask you about script direction. Because I have read some theories that those mirror signs that you were talking about are indicators of perhaps of bistrophodon texts that alternate direction, or perhaps some whole texts are written in one direction or another. And if I understood you correctly, you seem to be arguing that actually they have separate functions, or have I misunderstood you? I'm a complete beginner to Indus, so I apologize if I've misunderstood.
Yeah, this there are several signs which have a mirrored counterpart in the Indus sign list, and most of a mirrored counterpart have a very low frequency, so we cannot actually really make a clear distinction between these two different mirrored versions. But in this case, I have shown you we have enough data to be sure that these two mirrored signs are distinct signs. So I conclude that we should be aware of a possibility that all mirrored signs should be, first of all, treated as distinct signs. Yeah. And in most cases, the reading direction is from right to left. More than 90% of all texts conform to this reading direction. Only in a few cases you have a reading direction from left to right, or in some cases even boustrophodon, or top to bottom. But these are more or less exceptions. So in the doubtful cases, the reading direction is just marked with a question mark if there is no clear indication on the reading direction. But for the pattern texts, I can be sure if I see a pattern text which should be read from left to right, then of course I can see, okay, this is a clear pattern which also occurs in other texts written from right to left, and therefore I can clearly distinguish and identify the reading direction in these cases. And of course, in the database, all reading directions are normalized to the usual reading direction from right to left. But the sign orientation is kept the same as shown on the artifact.
Oh, thank you. That's a really clear explanation. Thank you very much for that. I wonder if any of the other conveners have questions for Andreas before I open it up to other viewers.
If I may, just thank you very much for your talk. Again, as well, I know nothing about this language. It was really really interesting, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the collaboration, about people with different expertise working on an ancient language like this. So if the statistical work, the mathematical work that you've been doing, how that interacts with a more traditional linguistic approach, if that has become a sort of platform for collaboration, or if there have been misunderstandings, or well, what has been your experience?
Yeah, this is the possibility to offer the cooperation platform, let's say, is one of the reasons to put this database online, to make the database accessible for everybody with interest in Indus writing after request. So people should just email me and ask for accessing the database. And there are other approaches from different authors using statistical methods on Indus writing, but most of them are using I have shown you the outdated corpus from Mahadevan from 1977, because this is the corpus available for them. But well, I have to say the digital corpus I have presented today is also available. Another thing is a critical thing on the statistical analysis done by other people is that they are putting all inscriptions together into one corpus and analyzing all texts as one corpus. But I have shown you that we must distinguish between different artifact types because of a possibility that the content on different artifact types depends on the functionality of this artifact, how it was used, and also the different text types I have already introduced. So this makes it more difficult, because at the same time, when you're dividing the corpus into different subcorpora, of course, when you're reducing the total amount of data which can be analyzed for statistical analysis. So there is you have to find a balance between the size of a corpus you are analyzing and the way how you look at the data. No? So this is an important thing you have to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've had one question in the chat about making the presentation available, but of course this recording stays on our YouTube channel in perpetuity. So Andreas's presentation is de facto available to everybody to watch again and again as much as you like. So yeah, I think it's a sort of fundamental principle of the way we work is that everything is available to you. And as Andreas said, he's happy to correspond by email as well. Gabby.
Yeah, I have again, speaking from ignorance, and thank you very much for this very clear presentation. I have a question sort of about the, again, about the history of scholarship and especially the relationship with other parts of scholarship in this area. I'm thinking that, you know, almost every undeciphered or partially deciphered language and script has various different theories, various different approaches and schools, and people who've worked on this, including people who claim to have completely deciphered the language, who no one else believes. You know, everything, you know, from both ends of the spectrum, from very serious to you know, people who've had revealed to them by angels or aliens or whatever the truth. And I'm wondering if your work has sort of had any unexpected results in confirming or has, you know, has been accepted by various different, and how it's interacted with the various different schools and various different approaches from, you know, from, yeah, the past scholarship in these texts. So a very, very big question.
Yeah, well, there are plenty of different claimed decipherments for Indus writing, and so I'm not talking about all of these ideas people already had, and most of them are quite fanciful. So I'm more restricted to what I call mathematical epigraphy before I'm jumping on to conclusions for interpretation of science. So this was also one of the reasons not to scratch this topic of the interpretation of science in this talk, because it was not the major focus today. But of course, there are some, let's say, basic understandings of certain classes of science, which I think can be shown independent on the assumption of any language, and not based on the and secondly, not based on the shape of a graph. So if you look at the specific shape of a graph and you say, oh, this looks like it must mean the same one. No, this is not the way I'm doing it. So one class of signs are the stroke signs, short strokes, long strokes, stacked strokes. And for a long time, it is known they represent some kind of numerical system. They occur together in the cluster of a sequence of stroke signs. And one of the results I have presented last year at a conference in Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan was the analysis of these stroke signs in combination with other signs, which allows me to determine the base of a numerical system. So the result was that long strokes belong to the decimal system, base 10, and short strokes to the octal system, base 8. So there are two different base systems used separately or sometimes even together in one text. Yeah.
Looking at Mesopotamian parallels where those number systems are dependent on the things being counted or measured, that doesn't surprise me at all, actually. That sounds a really lovely, neat discovery. There's a really interesting question in the chat, Andreas, about how whether you've analysed the corpus by time period or find spot to see if there are any changes over time.
This is a very interesting question, and it still needs to be done. There are some limitations on these analysis. So for the spatial distribution, we know most of the find spots. of the artifacts discovered in the 1930s. But let's see, we do not know the archaeological context.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to a publication of for the Mohenjo-Daro artifacts. Next year there will be a publication with about 36,000 artifacts excavated along with all the seals and tablets. And this will allow us to analyze the archaeological context the inscriptions have been found with. More complicated and critical is the question on the temporal distribution, because of not really, it's actually a lack of chronology. The excavations in the 1930s have recorded the depth value in feet below surface. And so the surface is gone. We don't know exactly at which level it was found. They have used certain strata classifications, counting from 1, 2, 3 down to the lowest stratum, but this does not represent stratigraphy. So it's just a horizontal measurement, a vertical measurement down to the lowest level, and you can analyze the vertical development within one mound or excavation area, but it's almost impossible to compare this development within one mound to the next mound because of the surface difference. Yeah. And another issue is, of course, the mixture of artifacts throughout the history. So secondary deposition and things like that. Yeah. So the temporal development is one of the topics I'm still working on, but this is a very big issue.
Thank you. You've given a really helpful description of the challenges of working with archaeological material excavated in the early 20th century. Again, I'm reminded, forgive me for using another Mesopotamian example, of the proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk in southern Iraq, which were excavated in the 1920s, and then much later analysis of re-excavation of the site made people realize that actually that there was actually no stratigraphy, because they were all really just dumped together. There were multiple periods of artifacts used as fill to create a platform to build a newer building on. And so one can do spatial analysis, but all it shows you is where the things have been emptied out from a bucket 5,000 years ago. So yeah, that fine detail is really challenging, isn't it? That new publication that you talked about, that sounds like it's going to, if I understand correctly, is that previously unpublished material that's going to massively increase the corpus that you work on?
No, it's not a corpus of inscriptions. It's a corpus of all artifacts. Right. So all the pottery and the bangles and so on, knives, daggers, and so on. They will be published in some way the next year, I was told. So, but it's still work in progress for the publication.
How much? I mean, obviously, just as in my field, one's very dependent on the random chance of excavation finding new inscriptions. But how much typically is still coming out? Are you working with essentially a closed corpus, or are you being able to add new texts to it at regular intervals? I mean, I could see from your chart that steady growth, but I wasn't sure whether that was because of the discovery of new material or just because of, working through existing publications and known artifact collections. How much is really new?
Yeah, there is an ongoing process of publications, and usually it takes 10 years or more after the excavation. The publication of the field reports is coming out. Sometimes we are still dealing with preliminary excavation reports, So this is one of the problems we are facing when looking for new inscriptions. Yeah, from time to time, some excavations will bring up new texts to light and make them as available in the news, for example. So that's sometimes a new highlight to have a new artifact. But yeah, this is a rare occasion currently. So yeah, so I don't think that we will ever reach this estimated corpus size of 30,000 or even 1 million texts. Not at all. No.
I'm also interested in comparisons with the work that's been done on Maya Hipu and the decipherment of knots and different types of knots and the spin direction, etc. That's been another really long-term database-driven project at Harvard, hasn't it? To try and make sense of an initially really opaque set of data. And I've been very interested, again, as an outsider thinking about decipherment, looking at how they've been able to move from the identification of decimal numeration systems, which has been known for decades, towards identifying or suggesting different types of text, some of which might be narrative and some of which are much more quantitative. Interesting ethnographic parallels as well. So it's been fascinating to see how your work and other groups on have been applying in their own way these different methods of systematic data encoding and then statistical and computational methods to try and identify patterns, frequencies, etc. And it's what's been very interesting is that both approaches are really not about language at all, that they're about what Peter Damerow, the great Sumerologist who died about 15 years ago, really, was really keen to emphasize that early script is about information storage. It's not about documenting spoken word. And so I wondered where, thinking about that, whether for you, it matters at all to think about what Indus script, whether Indus script might be a visual representation of a stream of sounds, or for you, will decipherment consist of knowing what information it contained and remaining language agnostic, just as, again, thinking about proto-cuneiform or some other scripts.
Yeah, I think that that about 50% of the Indus texts are dealing with some kind of administration. So some numerical information, some information about the fish signs representing weights are included in sign sequences. So I estimate that about 50% of the Indus texts have some kind of administrative purpose and content. I'm not saying that there is a Gilgamesh epos written in Indus writing. So inscriptions are too short for this kind of information. But looking at the complex texts and even the several pattern texts with a specific sequence and usage of certain classes of signs used as a grammatical marker at the end of the initial cluster, at the end of the terminal cluster, they represent some kind of grammatical structure. And so I think that these elements represent some phonetic values representing the pronunciation of certain words in some way. So if my estimation is correct, then we are dealing with a logographic syllabic writing system where every second sign is a logogram and the other second sign is a syllable. in average. Yeah. So if you have one sign, it's a logogram, and then you have a grammatical marker, you have this typical combination of grammatical affixing, or sometimes maybe even a prefix in front of a logogram can be demonstrated. It's sometimes difficult to identify these logograms and syllables, but there are some ways of looking at these signs. One example I have shown you, signs which occur only once at one complete text, most likely are used as logograms, at least sometimes. There is, of course, also the possibility of polyvalency, so that the same sign can be used as a logogram, but in other circumstances as a syllable. So this is, we know this also from other writing systems like uniform writing and my hieroglyphic. And so one sign doesn't mean it has only one function or meaning.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish the different signs using small additions, like little strokes on top may change completely the meaning. And so that's why we have so many different signs in the sign list, to make it to be sure that all these small variations are captured in the sign list and not thrown together into one sign.
Yeah, absolutely. Another very interesting question, thinking about the relationship between and the geographical proximity between Indus Valley and southern Iraq and the Gulf. So Manoj Jadhav asking in the chat about the similarity of the fact that he can see some similarities in the signs between Proto-Cuneiform and Indus, and just thinking about trade connection. So we know from the work of Shireen Ratnagar and others, and we can just see very much in the material evidence, can't we, that there were definitely trading connections between the two cultures. So what sort of influence do you think there might have been, whether it was unidirectional, bidirectional, in terms of development of script? Again, and then we can put in Proto-Elamite in there as well as this sort of middle thing, or is it just something that complex societies do because they need to record data? Do you think there might?
Well, I'm just thinking about the difficult question to be answered is about the chronology, the temporal placement of all these different writing systems. They have been used parallel for sure, but at which time, which was first introduced, which was second, I would prefer to analyze each writing system by its own before jumping onto any conclusion about the connection and the strong linkage between if you have one sign which looks similar to another one in a different writing system, maybe the idea of writing was copied, but I don't think that all the different sign variations have been copied from one system to the Indus system, or the other way around. So there is no famous Rosetta Stone found so far with 2 or 3 different writing systems and languages next to each other, giving the same content in different systems. So we have to base our analysis purely on the data we have from the Indus Valley, and so that's the situation we have. And the reason to introduce all these different mathematical methods in the epigraphy is to get as most information as possible out of the data we have without any assumption on the language and the interpretation of signs before we start with a linguistic analysis. So my experience from my work on working with the Phaistos test and also some Cretan hieroglyphic inscriptions is that you should start with an epigraphic analysis, get most information out of this data, from using statistical methods, and then you can start with, like say, an assumption, a hypothesis about the language, and saying, okay, what can I get some more information out of the data if I apply a certain language with a certain linguistic structure, the syntax on these inscriptions or not? So the database is very useful because it allows us to verify specific ideas. Actually, the falsification is the point where you say, okay, if it can be falsified, then it's a theory and you should check the database for your ideas. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons to give this database available to everybody, so that people can actually check their ideas against the data at hand.
That's great. So I think that's such a really clear encapsulation of your methodology and your principles that I think and we've been going for an hour. I think it's probably a good place to stop, actually. I know the questions are still coming into the chat, and I know lots of people would want to talk all night about this, but we've spent a really stimulating hour with you, and I think this is a really good time to say thank you. And I've learned a lot. It's been really stimulating for my thinking about my own research as well. So thank you very, very much. And I'm sure lots of other people who've been listening in are very grateful too. Thank you.
Thank you.
But have a visual clap like we do it. But thank you very, very, very much.